Our topic for today is China. And what I would like to do is tell you a little bit more about it. As 2020 draws to a close, China is more and more important for the United States and the future of the world. What kind of relationship does the US have with China, and how has it evolved in the past decades? How will Biden's relationship with China and the Chinese Communist Party differ from Trump's? How does Beijing view Biden compared to Trump, and just how dangerous could things get? And our presenter today is Isaac Stonefish. He is a senior fellow with the Asia Society Center on U.S.-China Relations in New York City. He is also a Washington Post opinions contributing columnist and an on-air contributor to CBSN and a visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund. Previously, he served as Foreign Policy magazine's Asia editor. He managed coverage of Asia and wrote about the politics, economics, and international affairs of China, Japan, and the Koreas. Formerly a Beijing correspondent for Newsweek, Stonefish spent 7 years living in China prior to joining foreign policy. He has traveled widely in the region and in the country, visiting every Chinese province, autonomous region, and municipality. Isaac's recent articles show the breadth of our presenter's interests, one of them being Boris Johnson's bad bet on China. How do we keep treating China as a source of reliable information? And that's a question. Why would we? And here's why America shouldn't trust Huawei, the Chinese technology company. Welcome those of you who have just joined us. Over to you, Isaac. We're with you.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you all for coming on this balmy Monday morning. So I want to start the talk in 2005 when the Deputy Secretary of State, Bob Zoellick, gave a speech portentously titled "Whither China?" And the idea was that China had become large and influential enough to start exerting real influence on international affairs. And what the US wanted was for China and the Communist Party to fit in, to shoehorn into the international order that the United States and Western Europe, and to a smaller degree, Japan had built since the end of World War II. The idea was for China to become a responsible stakeholder in the global system that the United States had built. And this was the policy that dictated relations between the United States and China until roughly 2016, when, among the other massive dislocations we've seen over the last several years, plenty of people in the administration, in Congress, in businesses decided that the previous framework wasn't really going to work. Where we are now is a confusing hodgepodge of tensions and friendship and sanctions. It's a big, big mess that I don't envy the Biden administration for having to untangle. Before I start, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about US-China relations, basically from the beginning of the modern era up into the present, and try to make some guesses about where it's going to go under the Biden administration. But I'd just like to preface with a few things. First, I'm going to be making some huge generalizations in the talk. China, as you all know, 1.4 billion people. It's an incredibly complicated place. And I'm going to use Beijing as a shorthand for the Chinese Communist Party, which has roughly 80 or 90 million members. Also a very, very complicated organization with a lot of different views and a lot of different factions. So one is that I'll be making generalizations. Two is that there are certain things that I just can't know, and I just don't know. There's a lot about the Communist Party that is incredibly opaque. So some of these are going to be assumptions. The other thing is that I'm an opinion writer. A lot of these are opinions. You might disagree with some of the things I say, and frankly, sometimes I'm wrong about these things. So in the Q&A, If you have questions, if you have comments, I very much welcome those because it's also a great opportunity for me to learn from you guys. So I think we can start not at the beginning because as Communist Party officials love to say, China has 5,000 years of history. But I think we'll start in 1972 when Nixon and Kissinger went to Beijing and eventually reestablished relations with China and with the party in 79. And the period from 72 to roughly 89, the idea of the relationship was predicated on the Soviet Union. So in several different periods of US-China relations, there was a reason why the United States decided to overlook some of China's gross human rights abuses, some of the incompatibilities in the close relationship, and it changed era to era. So very briefly, until 89, it was the Soviet Union. Then it was the growth of the Chinese market and the idea that we're going to democratize China. Then 2005 till roughly the end of the Obama administration was responsible stakeholder. And now we're in this yet to really be named period that people are calling a new Cold War. Don't love that phrase, but we're still trying to come up with something better. So that's the brief overview of how we got from the beginning to the end. And I'll go through and explain what happened in each of these periods that brought us to the present before talking about some of the issues with the present. So the general idea of reestablishing relations was because Beijing, there was something called the Sino-Soviet split. Beijing started moving away from Moscow. Beijing was afraid of having a war with Moscow, the idea of enemy of my enemy is my friend. And the top-level US leaders started meeting with top-level Chinese leaders. And probably the most important piece of that for today is that the US-China relationship, similar to US relationship with Saudi, has been very, very centralized for US government officials and former US government officials and top Chinese officials. So unlike other countries' relationships where there's a lot of ties on a lot of different levels of society, with Beijing and DC, it is very much usually 10 to 20 people. Sometimes it includes the president, the secretary of state, the former secretary of state, the former national security advisor. So when Kissinger worked to set up relations, he was integral in that he set the tone for it being a very closely held relationship. So the architecture of the relationship and the way it evolved was very much on this idea of, okay, so we're going to try to work together. We're going to try to nudge China out of the isolation that had cratered it during the Mao era, which was 49 to 76. And we're going to develop China as, if not an ally, then at least as not an enemy. Nixon, before taking office, wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs where he said something like, we can't let 800 million people stay outside of the realm of international affairs to nurture their grievances and build up their grudges. And Nixon and Kissinger did that. They helped bring China back into the League of Nations, we could call it metaphorically. So that idea of partnering with Beijing against the Soviets lasted until 89. And the two major events there, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the a little bit later eventual crack up of the Soviet Union, so less of a need to have Beijing as an ally against the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union was cratering and eventually dissolved. And then you had the Tiananmen Square massacre on the night of June 3rd and the morning of June 4th in Beijing. And the general idea in Washington at the time and across the country was, okay, this is a clear indication that China, the Chinese Communist Party, and communism in general is on the wrong side of history. And this will probably eventually lead to the end of the party. There were months of protests leading up to the Tiananmen Square massacre, and the general feeling was, okay, this is it. This is the end of the party. And relations basically stopped for several years. Things were very, very quiet. There were some secret trips by Bush and some of his top people and vice versa, but really very little investment until 92, 93, when almost, it's funny, almost organically, this new idea started to arise, which was, okay, China is a massive, relatively untapped market, and trading with China will bring liberalism into China. So there started to be this missionary aspect with US-China relations. And the idea was, okay, so Starbucks, McDonald's, US consumer behavior, if we start bringing these things to China, we'll not only make a lot of money because there's a massive Chinese market, but we'll be bringing democracy to China. I think Condi Rice in her confirmation hearings talked about an iron law of how economic liberalization brings democracy. And plenty of the people in both the Clinton White House and in both Bush White Houses talked about how, okay, we're doing this so that we can democratize China. And I mentioned a little bit before about the opacity of the Chinese system. It's really difficult to know if Chinese leaders at the time, people like Jiang Zemin, who is the chairman, and Li Peng, who is the premier, if they knew that A, that was US goals, and B, that they were able to manipulate American interlocutors into thinking, oh yes, we really want to politically reform, we're really moving towards a democracy, please do keep investing, please do keep entangling your country with ours, because we think this will be better for Chinese people who will become more democratic. That was a message they conveyed, and it's unclear if they knew from the beginning that that was never going to happen, or if they thought, okay, this is a risk that we're willing to take, or if they were secret party reformers who wanted that but weren't able to act on that because of the many constraints they had inside the party. That we're not going to know for a very long time until a lot more archives become open. But be that as it may, the US business community and ex-US politicians, especially Kissinger, but also people like Brent Scowcroft, who was the national security advisor under Bush, very quietly, both quietly actually and loudly, advocated for tighter trade relationships between the US and China, with the idea that this would help bring democracy to China. So this is how the relationship was until 2001. China joins the World Trade Organization. They're becoming part of the international community. The idea is great. We successfully did this. We brought them in. We're doing well by doing good. Our companies are going to make more money, and the Chinese people will get a delicious taste of American liberty is the way that I think a lot of people thought about it and talked about it. 2001, you had a incident in April, the spy plane incident, where a US spy plane, I believe, shot down and crashed into a Chinese spy plane. The Chinese held the US crew for roughly 2 weeks. Sort of a major crisis, the first crisis of the W. Bush administration. That got resolved. US-China relations were growing tenser, and then 9/11 happened. Chinese Chairman Jiang Zemin very cunningly and intelligently expressed his deep desire to partner with the United States to fight terrorism wherever it may be. This was, in many ways self-serving, in large part because of a region in China called Xinjiang. That's a region in the Northwest. There is a large Muslim population there who throughout the decades has been quite unhappy with being part of the People's Republic of China. I'll get more to them later. Some of you might have heard about them. That's the region where now there are concentration camps where roughly 1 million Muslims and other people have been sent over the last several years. But one of the things that happened with 9/11 was the easier ability for leaders like Jiang Zemin to say, hey, we also have a terrorism problem with our rest of Muslim population, and then treat them worse under the cover of fighting terrorism. So 2001 to 2005, the US foreign policy apparatus was very distracted by 9/11, wars in Iraq, wars in Afghanistan. Business community was still going strong, very excited about China's double-digit growth at the time. But the Bush administration, broadly speaking, mostly forgot about the potential political and military risk of China until roughly 2005. And then there was a policy shift, as evinced by that speech and by other things that were happening at the time, which was, okay, we don't really love the way that Beijing is starting to play internationally, and they're starting to get big enough where, oh, you know, this is certainly not Zimbabwe, this is not even Iran, this is a major power that is going to have a lot of influence globally. And because we're so influential in China, we can push the Chinese not only to reform, but to act, you know, again, responsible stakeholder. And what that means was responsible to US and global interests the way that the US defines them. You know, wasn't necessarily responsible for Chinese interests the way that Beijing defines them. That said, the overwhelming goal was that with enough meetings and some tough love and trainings, the United States would be able to liberalize and reform the party so that it acted more as a positive actor in global affairs. And for a lot of the people who were living in China at the time or watching China at the time, after the Beijing Olympics in 2008, there started to be this sense of, oh, maybe this isn't working. Maybe Beijing isn't marching towards more liberty. It started to get much worse after Chairman Xi Jinping took power in 2012, and then also in March 2013. And we've seen a huge backslide of a lot of liberties in China, you know, over the last 8 years or so that can be directly tied to the Xi regime. But basically, as US and China continued to evolve, the idea remained, okay, we can make this work. We can change China. Just pause here for a second to add another caveat about the way I talk about these things. There's a radical difference between China and the Chinese Communist Party. The party wants people inside and outside of China to think that there's not really a difference between China and the party. There's an old propaganda song, which is still popular today, which is, without the Communist Party, there is no new China. And the idea is that these two things are the same. You never hear Chinese officials in English talking about, you know, oh, this is what the party wants. This is what China wants. This is hurting the feelings of the Chinese people. This is offensive to China. They never say this is offensive to the Communist Party, because the way they want to express this is that what's bad for the party is bad for China, because the party protects, defends, and owns China. This is obviously not the case. It's never been the case in any country in the world. The government, the party don't own the country. They are not China. They are people who have been ruling China for the last 7 decades, but there's a radical difference between them and the people. And there's a huge variety of views about what should happen to China that are in some places very different from what the party wants. I had mentioned earlier this expression that people love to say, oh, China has 5,000 years of history. That is factually correct. But a lot of times when people say this, they're implying that, oh, okay, this is the continuation of the rest of Chinese history, that the party now rules China, and the party somehow harkens back to a lot of these ancient forces. The party has ruled China for roughly 1.5% of its history. At some point, the party will fall. We were talking a little bit before about predicting who's going to win the Georgia Senate race in January. Difficult to know. Someone will win. We can make a guess and then feel good about ourselves if we're right and not talk about it again if we're wrong. At some point, the Communist Party will fall. Whether that'll happen next year, in 20 years, in 200 years, it's impossible to say. But it's not inevitable that the party stays in power. Right now, it's coming up to the record for a one-party state in the modern era. It hasn't made it yet. I think that record is held by the what is it called? It's a Mexican party, PRI, which ruled, I think, for 79 years. So the party's getting pretty darn close, but not there yet. But long story short, the party at some point will fall. The party is not the same thing as China. So 2012, Chairman Xi Jinping takes power, and the Obama administration and Xi Jinping especially start discussing this under a framework of a new type of great power relations, is what Beijing wants to call it. And for the Obama administration, the second term, it's this recognition that, okay, well, we don't like the way that the direction China is going, but we feel like we need to work with them to solve certain global problems. Climate change was sort of the favorite one, and Secretary of State John Kerry made a very big deal about negotiations and a climate deal that the two sides signed. Maybe this is easy for me to say in hindsight, but we don't need to work with Beijing to fight climate change. And if the idea is that the only way we will be able to fight climate change is by listening to Beijing and by partnering with them, that puts a lot else of the relationship hostage. One of the things that these friends of China, the top level people who manage the relationship, they're very good at this sort of dichotomizing the relationship as sort of like, oh, okay, well, yes, there are a lot of these problems, but we don't want to be embarrassing about this. We don't want to bring up these inconvenient truths. We're just going to forget about this because we need Beijing to do this and this and this. So a lot of organizations that would normally be quite critical of Beijing are not, because they feel like, okay, we need to partner with them. Greenpeace is a very good example of that. One could expect Greenpeace to be quite angry about a lot of what Beijing is doing and has done with the environment, but they've decided, okay, we need to be utilitarian about this. It's in our interests and the globe's interests if we can hold our noses and partner with Beijing despite some of the horrific things they're doing. The problem with that viewpoint, which was reflected in so many different segments of US society and still is today, is that it's very easy for elements of the party state to recognize that, to see that, and to say, okay, well, we don't actually have to make these hard choices. They're going to partner with us anyway because they feel like they need to do this. So we sort of have the leverage here. As the Obama administration wound down, there was, to give them credit, a growing realization that Beijing would not fit into this international framework that the US had designed, and that the Beijing would not be a responsible stakeholder in the way that the United States had designed it. And they started working on policies and programs that would help to not encourage China to reform, but to constrain China so that it would be less of a risk. The biggest, easiest example is the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a trade deal with roughly 1 or 2 dozen nations that purposefully excluded China. And the idea was to liberalize trade between the United States and plenty of countries around China. Unfortunately, this was not a popular deal in 2016. A lot of US voters still frustrated and reeling from the after effects of globalization. Trump very publicly said he wouldn't be a part of it and left the deal very soon after taking office. Hillary Clinton also said that she would, pretty sure she said she would leave the TPP as well. Unfortunate case of US voters' pressure pushing the United States in ways that were against their foreign policy interests. But that was a signature piece of the Obama administration's China policy, because it was a way to increase our relationships and the strength of our relationships with our allies and try to push China out of that. Where we are today, and I'll break in a little bit to let Don jump in here and we can have a conversation about some of these things, but where we have gotten to in 2016 and what the Trump administration starting in 2018 started to do was recognize that this has been in many ways a very raw deal for US interests. And started to ask the question, okay, what should we do about this? From 2016 to 2018, the Trump administration, I would argue, mostly continued Obama-era policies. Trump notoriously during the campaign said that the Chinese were raping us, but the pushes in 2017 were much more for greater trade, greater integration. Then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson was a friend of Beijing and wanted to work with the party on a lot of issues. The 2 or 3 major things that changed in 2018 that brought us to where we are today were on the Chinese side. One was that Xi Jinping removed term limits for the chairmanship. This is a good time to do a very brief sort of 101 on Chinese titles and the Chinese political system. And then I'll get back to the other reasons why trade changed. But briefly, the Communist Party is run by the Politburo Standing Committee, which is now a 7-member body, all men, which is pretty standard for communist parties globally, especially in China and Russia. And Xi Jinping is at the top of the party, and Xi has 3 key titles. He's the General Secretary of the Communist Party, which is his most important title because that's the title that rules the party and the party rules the country. He's the chairman of the Central Military Commission. The Central Military Commission is the body that oversees the People's Liberation Army, which is the military in China. Note that it's not China's military. It's something that only, I think, North Korea, Vietnam, and Laos, and possibly Cuba have, which is it's the party's military. It's not the Chinese people's military. The name is deceptive, and it's not China's military. Imagine if the Pentagon and the Secretary of Defense swore loyalty to the Republican Party, or the Democratic Party. You get some idea of what the PLA is. It's the party's military. So Xi, from his position as chairman of the Central Military Commission, oversees the party's military, and he's the chairman of the country. This is the title that often gets used in English and mistranslated as president. There's no president in the Chinese system. It's chairman, but people call it president. It's another thing I like to rant about. It's a way to carry water for the party by making China seem like it has a more normal government when it is incredibly Leninist, by design from the beginning of party rule. But anyway, Xi is the chairman of the country. And what happened in roughly March 2018 is that they removed term limits for that chairmanship position. And this was seen by many people inside and outside China as a sign that Xi Jinping wanted to be, depending on how you feel about him, either chairman for life or dictator for life or leader for life. And that was a very worrying sign and a very clear indication for people in the US that, okay, well, this is not going to change. What had happened previously, the leader before Xi, someone named Hu Jintao, and then Chairman Jiang Zemin, who I mentioned earlier, they had both served roughly 10-year terms. And there was a successful and smooth transition of power, both in 2002 with some hiccups, which, a little nerdy and a side note, we can get into later if anyone's curious. But 2012 was a very smooth transition of power from Hu to Xi, and mostly smooth. And the assumption was that Xi Jinping was going to keep that and was going to rule for 10 years and then leave. In 2018, people started really waking up to the idea that, actually, that's almost certainly not going to happen. Today, less than 2 years before the next standing committee is supposed to take power, they serve 5-year terms, sometimes 1, sometimes 2. There aren't anyone in the standing committee or any top leaders elsewhere who seem to be being groomed to replace Xi. So maybe he'll step down and actually rule the country from another perch. Maybe he'll stay on as chairman. Maybe he'll give up one of his titles. It's unclear exactly how he'll do it. It's somewhat similar to what Putin has been doing in terms of paving the way to stay in power, regardless of what the Constitution says. But that happened in 2018 and crystallized frustration with the way China was going. Another thing that happened was Beijing started to act really atrociously in Xinjiang and started rounding up Muslims and putting them in what they called re-education camps. And the effect of this, I mean, I think it's frustrating to me, to talk about these issues, and people will say, well, yes, the Trump administration caused a lot of families to be separated along the border. That's horrible and atrocious, and I condemn that fully. What has happened in Xinjiang and is happening in Xinjiang is far worse, in numbers, in scale, in the cruelty of how they're treating these Uyghur people and other minorities, other ethnic minorities in Northwest China. We don't have good numbers of how many people have died. There's a lot of testimony of camp survivors, but there aren't really good statistics. The reason why people have started calling this genocide is because of a massive forced sterilization campaign in Xinjiang. I think that births dropped roughly 25% in 2019. It's one of the worst atrocities that's happening in the world right now, and it's complicated because there are a lot of places in China where people can and do live like happy, meaningful lives and have a somewhat testy relationship with the government and the party, but can in a lot of ways go about their business. That's not the case in Xinjiang. And it's very, it's just objectively an atrocity and a crime against humanity that's happening right now in China. But B, one wonders, and I'm very much not the only one who wonders this, a lot of Chinese people wonder this too. It's, okay, why would the party stop in Xinjiang? Why would this type of repression not spread to other areas that the party is worried about jeopardizes its control? So the situation in Xinjiang started bleeding into US-China relations in a way that I think is important, positive. The other reason is that there is sort of a shift in the power balance in Trump's cabinet, and Trump himself started doubling down on his long-held idea that trade deficits are bad. It's something he's ranted about since the 80s with Japan. And the trade war started with, okay, how do we rebalance the massive trade deficit we have with Beijing? Now, things have shifted a little bit. Certainly back then, there was a widespread view among economists that trade deficit doesn't really matter, and why is Trump yelling about this? There's currently a lot of bipartisan support for having a better, and I hate the phrase tough on China, but just a more critical strategy towards Beijing. But there's no, one of the things that makes my job so interesting and so frustrating is that there is no end game that we have. There's no clear strategy with what do we want from Beijing that's realistic. So I'll use North Korea as a comparison, and then Don, I'd love to bring you in and we can chat about this. But the idea with North Korea is, okay, maybe the strategy is we need to remove Kim Jong-un from power. And perhaps that would cause massive riots in North Korea. Perhaps some rogue general would take power and they would start bombarding Seoul. But we think the risks of that are lower than if he stays in power. Or, well, we need to find a way to get him to give up his nukes. And that's the priority. And maybe we need to do that by removing him from power. Maybe we need to strengthen his rule, which is what Trump thought. Hard to say, but there's an end game. There is no end game with our relationship with Beijing. There's no consensus and there's no strong voices that are arguing, okay, we need to do this for this reason. Do we need to remove the Communist Party from power? Maybe. Do we need to empower Chinese people to have a greater say in their own leadership? Maybe. Do we need to understand that China will soon be the world's most powerful country and gracefully yield in some ways like the UK did after World War II? Maybe. But what we need is a national debate about how we want to handle relationships with China. Because if we keep doing these things in a scattershot fashion, we're going to be far less strategic about it, and the outcome is going to be far more devastating for Americans.
Thank you, Isaac. Wow, what a tour de force, as they say, in bringing us up to date. I'm old enough to have lived through all these periods that you've talked about, except the 3,000 years ago ones. But what a memory push it was for me as I listened to you go through to where we are today. What we were anticipating was a little bit more about what's going to happen under Mr. Biden and vis-a-vis the Chinese relationship. So could you go a little bit into that?
Definitely, definitely. So, again, with the caveat that I'd be a much wealthier man if I could predict the future. These are just going to be guesses, but I think there's two ways that the 2 to 3 ways the Biden administration will be stronger on China, and then 2 to 3 ways that it'll be weaker. So the ways that it'll be stronger is that we will have a much more professional foreign policy apparatus, and we will make almost certainly smarter decisions because of that. There's certainly plenty of times when the professionals get it wrong, but I think it's safe to say that the likelihood is that they will be more strategic, they will be more thoughtful with how they deal with Beijing. Another way that they'll be stronger, one of the greatest strengths that the US has and one of the greatest influences that the United States has in China is that it shows Chinese liberals that one can be a large, powerful democracy. There's this obsession with China's size, both among the party and among the people. And the only other major country, the only other 2 major countries that, in some ways rival China in population size, one is India, and the general view in China is that India is just too chaotic to serve as a model. And the other is Indonesia, which Chinese people just generally don't respect, unfortunately. And the United States has been this idea, this shining beacon on a hill of, okay, we can have a healthy multi-party democracy and be very wealthy. So the United States has long supported that idea in China, and it's been something that's been very frustrating for the party. There's also a huge dissident community in China that various US actors try to strengthen, try to amplify their voices, and try to show to people in China, hey, there's another way of doing this, there's another way of being. And the Biden administration will almost certainly be seen as a much healthier type of democracy and will bring the United States back into a position where it's seen more as a global leader as opposed to Trump's America First brand. Another major thing the Biden administration will do is work much closer with US allies. And this has long been a talking point of the Biden administration, but it is something that they will almost certainly do. And it is fairly easy to do. There's a lot of frustrations among China's neighbors about China's growing strength. And from countries that have long been US allies like Japan and South Korea to countries that are even closer in China's camp like Nepal and Cambodia, there's a worry that Beijing's influence will spread in ways that is harmful for the local governments. And so it's not that hard to have like basically an anti-Chinese wall, so to speak. And there's a lot of desire for that, both among some of Biden's foreign policy people and among a lot of people in governments in these countries. I say this desire, and I mean this in a lot of times in a quiet way. A lot of these countries' leaders understand the risk to them of publicly challenging Beijing, so they rarely do it. But when you have private conversations with these people, you get the sense that they recognize the real risk to them. And this is, it's much more acute in places like India, which has fought border wars with China and where there's some serious skirmishes over the last several years, in places like Vietnam, which was the site of China's last war in '79. And there's a lot of worry and anger and frustration towards Beijing's expansion. The reasons why the Biden administration might be weaker on China, one I would say is climate change. There is this real sense that we need to work with Beijing to fight climate change. And there's a bit of an intellectual vacuum on okay, if we're not partnering with Beijing, how do we fight climate change? Because it can't just be, well, we need to hold our nose and do this, because that's, like I said, a very constraining opinion. But the Biden administration is much more concerned about climate change and much more likely to think, okay, well, we should really weaken our policies in other areas so that we can partner with Beijing on climate change. And I would guess, it's an impossible counterfactual, but I would guess that it won't really make a difference in how Beijing fights climate change. It'll just be something that Beijing uses as an excuse. So that's one thing. I think that can be especially acute if John Kerry becomes sort of like a global climate czar, which is possible. Kerry would love to come back into the administration in some way. That's a possible role that I've heard floated for him. The climate change deal with China is part of his legacy, and so he has a strong personal incentive to try to keep that deal alive or try to build on that deal. So that, I think, would be harmful for US interests vis-a-vis China. The other issue is the strength of Hollywood in the Biden administration and in Democratic administrations. Hollywood is in this strange place of being both of the powerful sectors of US society, the most left, the most democratic, and also, I would argue, the most pro-Beijing. And there's this strong sense in Hollywood that, okay, we need to partner with Beijing because this is where the growth of films comes from, and there's a lot of Chinese money going into Hollywood movies. And Hollywood, very different from TV and very different from other sectors of society, Hollywood refuses to criticize Beijing and refuses to criticize China, refuses to have any sort of scene or indication in the movies that might in some way be offensive to party censors. It's very striking and very surprising. But if you just look at it through those lenses, you see it come up time and time again. And if people are interested, I can get into that a little bit deeper. But a lot of Hollywood money supports Biden. A lot of powerful Hollywood people support Biden. And that could act as a restraint on some of the other policies the Biden administration might want to play with Beijing. The other powerful group that tends to be slightly more left than right, though this one is certainly a lot more mixed than Hollywood, is the sort of Wall Street, New York financial, Goldman Sachs community, the Bloomberg types to a degree. These folks also tend to be a lot more pro-Beijing. And one of the areas where China's economy has become more open rather than less open in the last year or two is financial services. So there's a huge push among a lot of people in the Wall Street community to have more access to Beijing, and they're going to push the Biden administration for that. Some of the most powerful people outside of the Trump administration, in the Trump administration, were financial people. Schwartzman is a good example. Schwartzman almost certainly will try to play the same role in the Biden administration. Adelson will probably sit this one out. Sheldon Adelson, the casino magnate, is very tied to Republican ties. He's seen as an Israel person, and that's where his passion and his wife's passion lie. But I think something like 93% of his net worth comes from casinos in Macau, some absurdly high number. So he has to be a China person as well, and he's another sort of constraint on government behavior when it comes to China.
Very good. Talking a little bit about whether China will work towards democracy, and if we look at the recent history in Hong Kong, one gets the impression that no, if anything, it's going the other way. Do you have any comments there as to how far that will go?
It's so hard to know. What's happening in Hong Kong, I find to be really depressing. Hong Kong was this beautiful aberration, this window between China and the rest of the world, this semi-independent territory with its own very rich culture. And I think it was in some ways an experiment for the party. And there's been this long hope among Chinese liberals that places like Hong Kong and places like Taiwan will change the party as opposed to vice versa. But the party very cannily, I would say, and sadly, has ended that experiment and wants Hong Kong to turn into a regular Chinese city. There's much less of a need in the party's mind for Hong Kong to serve as a way station for capital coming in the country, capital going out of the country, for somewhat dangerous ideas. Hong Kong, for a long time, and even today to a lesser degree, would allow Falun Gong protesters. Falun Gong is a spiritual sect that's banned in the mainland. There's a lot more examples of organized religion in Hong Kong. There's a lot more British influence in Hong Kong. And for a lot of reasons, one being probable growing strength of the cities of Shenzhen and Shanghai as financial centers, and growing repression under Xi Jinping, and growing fear of dangerous, destabilizing ideas coming in from Hong Kong and spreading throughout the rest of the mainland. Hong Kong's, I don't even want to say Hong Kong's days are numbered. I mean, Hong Kong's days as a semi-independent territory are over. And I would really love to be wrong about this. I would really love for the pro-democracy lawmakers who have been kicked out recently to be reinstated. And I'd love, Don, for you to call me in a few months and say, aha, you know, Hong Kong is going in a better direction, and you know, that they have freer elections, or this happened or that happened. But I think Hong Kong is done, and I think that's very sad.
Don, may I ask a follow-up question?
Maybe not, but go ahead.
Given what you've talked about Hong Kong, what's your focus on what's likely to happen with Taiwan?
That's a great follow-up question. So I think one of the reasons why Beijing has been harsher on Taiwan is the general sense that Taiwan is moving away from the mainland, and that Beijing doesn't need to show that it can treat Hong Kong well to regain Taiwan. And I think it's an indication that the likelihood of a Chinese military strike over Taiwan is growing. I mean, I hate to say this, but this is an almost ideal time to do that because the United States is distracted. The reason why Taiwan is not military occupied by the PRC is because of the United States, period, end. It's been the explicitly stated goal of every Chinese administration from Mao onward that they will regain Taiwan, and they will regain Taiwan by force if necessary. And the general sense was, okay, we can wait. We can hopefully convince the Taiwanese that this is in their best interest to do that. When Xi Jinping met with the former leader of Taiwan, Ma Ying-jeou, the idea was, okay, the countries are going to get economically tied close enough that eventually there'll be some sort of de facto one country, two systems, which is what the relationship is between Beijing and Hong Kong and Beijing and Macau. And so that you don't actually need to invade Taiwan. One party official said around the time, this is, you know, winning the battle without firing the shot. You can make Taiwan de facto part of China. Right now, already Beijing says that Taiwan is part of China. Most international organizations shamefully do the same thing. What is it? The World Bank or the IMF calls it Taiwan province. One of them calls it Taiwan district. You know, international organizations don't refer to Taiwan as a separate country, and often refer to Taiwan as part of China because it's a requirement of Beijing. But yeah, I mean, I think the most likely cause of World War III is Beijing invading Taiwan and the US stepping in, because Beijing has said they will invade Taiwan if they need to. Taiwan moves too close to independence, and the US has said they will defend Taiwan if Beijing invades. And so if Beijing decides to push, then we will have a massive war. Hopefully it'll be a quick and localized massive war, but these are dangerous times.
It's true. Canada has announced that they're going to entice more and more Hong Kong people to come to Canada, the ones that have the technical or other knowledge that Canada needs. And I wonder, US seems to be working against this kind of idea to have the people come from these countries that are in turmoil to the US to benefit the United States. And I wonder, is there something wrong with the American policy of shutting the doors to these kinds of resources, or what do you think there?
One of my biggest frustrations about the way that the US has handled the pandemic is it's made it much easier for people to move away from the idea of the US as a country with open borders. And I think this is a terrible time to advocate for more immigration and to bringing more people over. I still believe that, yes, like Canada, like other places, we should warmly welcome people from Hong Kong. We should warmly welcome people from China. We should warmly welcome dissidents from China. But this, I don't know what Stephen Miller has done over the last 6 months in terms of closing the door on immigration in ways that we can't see or aren't paying attention to, but he's a very canny operator, and he got dealt probably the best hand he could imagine for restricting immigration into the United States. And so I think there's so many things that we've been distracted from, and I think immigration is one that hasn't gotten nearly enough attention.
We have a question from one of the people in the audience here I'd like to read to you. It's from Li Fei Chang, and he says US-China relations worsen as China's threat is being touted as the iron truth. In other words, that China represents a threat to the United States. But we never asked whether the US threat to China is just as disturbing to the Chinese regime. The fundamental question is why we are not reviewing history, particularly progress, to guide our foreign policy. Foreign policy cannot be rigid based on the assumption we can always change other regimes. What should we change and adjust to induce more progress with China? The facts are telling us that China is changing fast. Why can't we be part of that?
Yes, I think that's a great point. China is changing fast. I mean, we're also changing fast. This has been one of the most unpredictable and radical years in recent US history. The changes that we've had in 2020 have not been positive. Hopefully 2021 will be a much more positive year, but neither the US nor China is in any way static. I think the other point you brought up, I think, is a good one. The US does, and I would argue should, pose a threat to the Chinese regime. The very important thing to emphasize here is that the US should not pose a threat to Chinese people. And one of the reasons why the Republicans have been, I would argue, better about their China strategy than the Democrats is that there's this real fear among the Democrats of doing anything that would allow them to be branded as racist or not woke or anti-Asian. And I think one of the problems with our China strategy is that it's not clearly and very directed at the Communist Party and not at Chinese people. And there's also been some really horrific issues with racism against Chinese people in this country, both Chinese people, Chinese Americans, and other Asian Americans. And I think leaders on the left have done a good job of condemning that racism, and I also fully condemn that racism. I think the issue is that too much people believe that China and Chinese and the party are the same thing. And the more we listen to the Communist Party and let them say that they are China, the worse that this gets. The NBA scandal, when was that? Everything feels like so long ago now, but the massive scandal with the Houston Rockets general manager tweeting and then deleting a tweet about Hong Kong. One of the most offensive parts of that scandal to me was a statement by Joseph Tsai, a Canadian Taiwanese, one of the early founders of Alibaba, who owns the Brooklyn Nets. And he was trying to explain why this was such a big deal. And he said, well, on the issues of territorial integrity, 1.4 billion people feel the same way. And I found that to be such an offensive thing to say, because no, of course, 1.4 billion people don't feel the same way. There's never been a situation where all these people agree about anything. There's such a radical divergence of viewpoints among people in China because they're human beings, and human beings think differently from each other. And there are a few things that are more fascist than saying, yes, everyone in this country stands behind this strong government on this issue. I've had hundreds of conversations with people in China about Taiwan and territorial issues. Some people agree with the party. Some people don't want to say anything about it. Some people strongly disagree with the party. I gave a talk a few years ago at a university in Shanghai, and ask the students, okay, so if there was war with Taiwan, how many of you would want to go? How many of you would be excited about it? Not a single person raised their hand. Maybe at a different class in Beijing, everyone would, some people would. People have radically different views. On the sort of general issue of progress, I guess I unfortunately don't believe in historical progress. It'd be nice to think that there's some sort of shared community of nations that the US and China can live in together. But one side is going to have to majorly yield. And maybe it'll be the US side and maybe it'll be the Chinese side. But I don't believe that there's a way for the two sides to set aside their differences on a government level, not on an individual or personal level.
Yeah, interesting. We have another question here from the audience. It's Merla Morrison, and she was referring back to your comments about the difference in armies or whatever. Mm-hmm. Is there a parallel national or regional army in much as there are here in the United States, I guess, militias or whatever?
So that's a great question. I think the answer is officially no, not at all, but in reality, almost certainly the case. One of the things that the party center is very afraid of is local officials building up regional military forces, because that will allow them to challenge the center. In 2012, there was a Chinese official named Bo Xilai, who is the party secretary of a metropolis called Chongqing, and he made some meetings with local military installations, and people reading the tea leaves have said, oh, maybe this is him trying to build up military support to overthrow Xi Jinping and to have a coup in the party. We don't know if that's actually what happened. We don't know if that's just the way people are interpreting it, but there is this sense that that is certainly possible. It's also one of the reasons why Chinese officials tend to circulate around the country. So usually someone will run a province for a year, several years, 5 years, but rarely longer than that, because the party center doesn't want them to develop a massive local power base. The major exception to this is Xinjiang, where it's sort of run by this organization called the Military and Construction Corps. And that's a paramilitary organization that is incredibly powerful in Xinjiang. We don't fully understand how, but they, in some ways that are somewhat akin to the situation in Chechnya, where a local warlord runs the place and Putin sort of leaves him alone. That's kind of what's happening in Xinjiang and to a smaller degree in Tibet.
Oh, thank you. The next question from the audience, Serge Migdal, is saying, didn't China just sign a trade pact with some Asian countries? And that was announced, I guess, in today's New York Times. But also, of course, the pact that Trump got out of didn't allow China to be part of that group. And now this is a Chinese-based replacement, as it were. And I wonder what you thought of the countries that are joining, because the US did make an attempt to prevent some of the European, and I think even Canada, from signing with the Chinese.
Nature abhors a vacuum, and when the US retreats from its global commitments, it's easy and rational for Beijing to try to fill that void. One of the real worries with the US having looked inward is that it allows Beijing to expand outward. And one of my hopes for the Biden administration is that they are much more multilateral, they are much more globalist, and that they allow for the US to regain some control of this. You get a lot of power by writing global trade rules, just like the US dollar allows for a lot of power for America, just like the dominance of the US financial system allows for a lot of power for America globally. Being able to dictate some arcane, some common measures of trade is incredibly influential. So I do hope that under a Biden administration, we start having these multilateral trade agreements that are run by the US or strongly influenced by the US. I think in all of these things, I feel like there's in some ways an old leftist in me that hates the idea of the US having all of this global influence. But I spent enough time in China to say that A, there are a lot of major problems with the US having all this global influence, and B, I'm far more comfortable with the US doing it than the Chinese Communist Party doing it. I think if we were in a situation where China had a far better government, one can argue we should yield to history and allow the world's most populous country to be either a global leader or the global leader. But China under the Communist Party, I think that's very dangerous for the world.
What attracted me to you a year ago or so was reading some of the things you were saying about the, as could be called, the parroting of Chinese rules by American companies in China. And of course, this is a question that's always being raised, is whether or not the Chinese are stealing the technical knowledge of the Americans that are over in China. Have you got more comments on that recently? Have things got easier for American companies or less so?
I would argue that they've gotten more difficult. I mean, the pandemic has just made almost everything more difficult. So it's hard to, in some ways, separate that out. But I think the question of intellectual property theft is something that so many US companies privately grumble about and publicly ignore, because there's this sense, well, okay, if I talk about this, they're just going to go and work with my competitor. And Beijing and party officials excel at picking a US company, strengthening them, and having them sort of act as an advocate for Beijing globally, while at the same time making it very clear that they could always work with the company's alternative. Boeing is perhaps the best example of this. And the reason Boeing is the best example is twofold. A, Boeing and the global airplane market is a duopoly. So you either have Boeing or Airbus. Boeing is American, Airbus is a European consortium. So it's very easy for Beijing to say, well, we didn't like what Boeing did, or we didn't like what the US government did, so we're going to punish Boeing. And then that pushes for Boeing to advocate in Washington for closer relations with China. The other reason why Boeing is such a perfect example is because basically all of its sales go to state-owned enterprises, and it's much easier for Beijing to coordinate that. So Boeing is in some ways the opposite of Coca-Cola. It's very difficult for Beijing to say, okay, don't buy Coca-Cola. But the 20 or 30 people who make the decisions about who buys Boeing planes, it's much, much easier to corral them. So there's a lot of pressure on companies like Boeing to share IP with Chinese partners and to not complain if some of that IP falls off the back of a truck. Another good example is Tesla. And Tesla is now the poster child for US-China cooperation. And people think of Tesla and they say, oh yeah, it's easy to do business in China, or China's very welcome to US investment. And they just ignore the difficulties that the other major US automakers face in Beijing and in China more broadly.
Our colleague Tyler asks you a question, and he's saying that China's recently announced 5-year economic plan emphasizes creating more domestic supply chains to limit dependence on imported goods. If carried out, wouldn't that hamper US export opportunities?
Yes. Yes, it very much would. And I think there's a growing worry in Beijing that the US wants to constrain China. The US doesn't want to provide Beijing with some of the materials it needs for economic development. And so they are looking inward as well. And I think this is a trend. We're going through a sort of an isolationist period globally. And this is Beijing recognizing that, especially in areas like semiconductors and certain types of technology that the US and Taiwan and Japan and South Korea really dominate, Beijing needs to spend a lot of money and resources allowing itself to have domestic production of these issues. It's somewhat akin to the US realization that Beijing has enough control over the market for processing rare earth minerals, which are used and very valuable in batteries of electric vehicles and iPhones, and that they can't depend on China for the supply of the processed minerals. So they need to find a way economically viable or not, to start processing those either in the United States or in countries where there's far less of a risk that Beijing will cut off the supply.
Mal, you
Yes,
a question?
one of our guests asked the question, can you please comment on Huawei? And let me add to that the question, you just talked about Boeing. Is Huawei America's Boeing? I mean, is China's Boeing and this tit for tat kind of thing, or is it something really substantively different?
I like the comparison to Boeing. I think in some ways it is, in some ways it isn't. So Huawei is a major telecommunications company. I think it's the world's largest producer of telecommunications hardware. And the real issue with Huawei is the relationship between Huawei and Beijing. And Huawei's founder, Ren Zhengfei, has said dozens of times that they're not state-owned, they're not state-controlled, they don't share secret information with Beijing. And none of these things are believable. It's a situation where the corporate structure of many Chinese companies are too opaque to know whether he's telling the truth or not. And frankly, one major issue with US-China relations, which this question prompted, which I'm grateful for, is this issue of trust. And if you trust Beijing and the party to be acting in the best interests of China and Chinese people and the US and the world, then you really should discount most of what I've said. And the problem, the way that I see these things is that we can hear what party officials say, and they say radically different things in English and Chinese, and it's a lot more worrying what they say in Chinese. We've seen the actions they've taken in places like Xinjiang, and with respect to some US companies, to many Chinese companies, to many powerful Chinese people. And I don't think that our right strategy should be trust but verify. I think that a lot of these companies we do need to approach with mistrust. That said, Huawei has certainly gotten it worse than a lot of companies in China that you kind of think would deserve it based on their background. So one company that gets almost no attention, much to the benefit of this company, is Lenovo, which bought IBM's laptop business in 2006 or so. Lenovo, so Huawei officially is not state-owned at all. I think it's something like 98% owned by a Huawei union, which is very state-controlled as far as we can tell. Lenovo is part state-owned. Lenovo, I think, is something like 9% owned by the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, which is a state-owned sort of think tank and university arm. And it is, to a large degree, state-directed because that's the way you have to operate when you're in Beijing. I mean, we see this even for companies that seem to be a lot more independent. The big example is what happened with Ant Group, which was a close partner, still is a close partner with Alibaba, Jack Ma's company, one of the world's largest tech companies. The Ant Group IPO, which was supposed to happen in early November, was supposed to be the world's largest IPO. But right before the IPO, Chinese regulators stepped in and said, no, not going to happen. And we still don't know quite why they stopped the IPO, but it was a really clear indication of Beijing's power over Chinese financial markets. And you can trust that Beijing was acting in the interest of stakeholders and Ant Group and the Chinese people, or you can not. But I guess sort of to add to what I had said before, the two really important things are you have to think whether or not you trust the party or not, and you have to understand that the party is incredibly powerful. So regardless of what Huawei says about what it does, it has to have a close relationship with the party, otherwise it would not be powerful. And just as a general way of being with this, you have to think, oh, do we trust the Communist Party or do we not? And this is radically different from saying, do we trust Chinese people or do we not? And Chinese people are just like people everywhere else. You know, like I trust some Americans, some I don't, some I'm ignorant about and I make misjudgments about, but it's not at all a referendum on Chinese people or their inherent trustworthiness or not. It's the government and the party that they have.
Going completely in a different direction, what is the Chinese relationship with the United Nations?
The Chinese relationship with the United Nations is similar, I would say, to Beijing's relationship with international trade bodies, which is noticing US desire to move away, and so trying to fill that vacuum. I'd say the most important difference, well, two most important differences. One, China has been a permanent member of the UN Security Council for a very long time, so they're a lot more entrenched in the UN than they are in a lot of other international bodies where their influence has been more recent. And the second thing is that Beijing's most important issue in the UN regards Taiwan. Beijing has been working for decades to internationally isolate Taiwan. And the number of countries that recognize Taiwan has dropped, I think, from something like a few dozen in the 20s and several dozen in the 80s to now something like, what is it, like 14 or 15? And I think the most important polity there is Vatican City. It's mostly Pacific Island nations and small, obscure African nations. So Beijing uses the UN to internationally isolate Taiwan, and it sometimes uses the UN to work closely with the United States, and sometimes uses it to work against the United States.
One question we have from the audience, James Harberger. What is your view of Chinese education versus the United States education?
I think it's a very important question. It's such a broad issue. One of my frustrations is that every year or two, we get these statistics that say China outperforms the US in this test or that test. And people rarely read the study, which says that the Chinese study was conducted in Shanghai. I think in a limited number of high schools in Shanghai, and in the United States, it was conducted throughout the US. So we're comparing some of the best education in China with the US education on average. I think there's two main reasons why, well, several main reasons why US universities, I would argue, are much better than Chinese universities, some justified and some not. One is that English is a global language, and there are not enough people globally who speak Chinese outside of China. That is something that I hope changes. I do firmly believe in the importance of learning Chinese. It's a fascinating language and fun and maddening to learn. But if more people spoke Chinese in the United States, it'd be more appealing for them to go to Tsinghua or Beijing University, because they could take classes in Chinese and integrate there, whereas so many more Chinese speak English, so it's easier for them to go to Harvard or Iowa State. The other is just sort of the plain old-fashioned freedom of speech. It's much easier to discuss ideas in US universities, and you think there's a lot of debate and a lot of frustration among some segments of US society about trigger warnings and issues of free speech. And oh, this is trampling on my free speech rights because I can't say this about Trump, or I can't say this, or stop policing how I speak. It's so much worse in Beijing. And in a lot of ways, it's not worse in that it's a radically different system. It's worse by a matter of degree, but the freedom to speak in a US classroom, however constrained you might feel you are, is so much narrower in Beijing. And a lot of times what happens is US professors or US lecturers will go to China, they'll lecture at a university, and they'll say, oh yeah, like I could talk about Taiwan and no one said anything, and therefore like we have free speech in China. Those aren't the rules. The party talks about Taiwan more than any other entity. The party talks about Xinjiang all the time, talks about Tibet all the time. The issues are things, advocating viewpoints that the party feels like destabilizes the party or China. So it's one thing to say, hey, what do you guys think about Taiwan? It's another thing to say that I believe Taiwan is an independent country, and I believe that Taiwan should be independent and the party should relinquish its claims to Taiwan. What do you think about that, and what do you want to do about it? It's one thing to say, hey, what do you think about Xinjiang? It's another thing to say, hey, I think these are like really terrible crimes against humanities that are happening in Xinjiang. Here's what I think people should do about it. And then the other reason, US universities have a lot more money than Chinese universities. I mean, some have probably a lot more money than they need, looking at you, Harvard. But they, a lot more money, a lot more time, a lot more experience. And it's still, and this could change, but it's still seen that New York City and Boston and DC are much more livable places than Chinese cities, though that is changing.
One of the things we read about now and then from Chinese students in the United States and others in the United States is how that they are being contacted by seemingly the Chinese authorities from somewhere, and being made to be aware that their words are being followed and their actions are being followed, even though they're in this foreign country of the United States as compared to being at home in China. Should we believe all of these stories that China is reaching out to the diaspora?
Yes, I very much think we should, and it's case by case basis on the individual story, and I'm sure some are overblown, but it's a real dilemma for U.S. educators, especially in the era of Zoom, and Zoom is not a secure platform, but I think we're all speaking publicly here. But if let's say you're a professor and you're teaching a group of students, and some are Chinese and some are not, you don't want to put the Chinese student in a compromising position by asking them, what do you think about Xinjiang? But you want to treat them like other people, and you want them to be allowed to express their viewpoint. And you have to recognize that that is a violation of Chinese laws to do so, or that Beijing can decide to say, okay, you express this viewpoint and that engendered social stability, so judicially or extrajudicially, we're going to cause problems for you. So it's a real dilemma among people teaching Chinese studies, or people who have a lot of Chinese students in their class. And I wish I had a good solution for it, because getting off Zoom and moving back to the real world will be very helpful for that. But I don't know what the best solution or the least harm is, because you don't want to teach, you don't want to self-censor, you don't want to teach a class when you don't talk about Tibet or Xinjiang, or you don't ask the Chinese students, or you don't treat them like the other students. Yeah. That said, it's just much riskier for them.
Yeah.
Don?
Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, Isaac, you talked early on about probable Biden policies, but I was wondering your perspective on the practicalities of certain things, because we've had essentially a 4-year hiatus from being part of TPP, the immigration policies, a lot of other things going on, the weakening of the State Department and other agencies other than the Defense Department. As a practical matter, what does it take for a Biden administration to become effective in terms of implementing, not just formulating strategies, but implementing strategies in this kind of a time frame, when they're not even being allowed to hear the intelligence reports?
So I think that gets at a really important question that we won't know until we can look back on this period. Is this an interregnum from rationality and good leadership, or is this the way things are going to be moving forward? There's still plenty of brilliant people at all levels of the State Department and the Pentagon, and some of the work that some of the officials did under Trump, I believe in and I support. Trump himself and some of the ways that cabinet officials had to sort of suck up to Trump were, deeply offensive and deeply disturbing and deeply debilitating to U.S. government and U.S. morale. So there's going to be a huge personnel change, and personnel is policy in a lot of these places. And, certainly the longer that this uneasy transition persists and the longer the pandemic persists, the harder it will be to go back to where we were in the Obama era. But it's just really difficult to know if, 6 months from now or a year from now, things are going to feel like very competent and surely ran again, or if it's still going to feel very messy and very chaotic because we're still recovering from the reverberations of that period.
Isaac, I think getting towards the end here, I wondered if you wanted to say a little bit about the Asia Society,
Hmm.
who controls it and what it does, these kinds
So
of questions.
yeah. So I'm very loosely affiliated with the Asia Society. The new president is someone named Kevin Rudd, who was Prime Minister of Australia, and who has views on Beijing that I generally firmly disagree with. I think like I had mentioned early on, Beijing does an excellent job of making it seem like the relationship is controlled by a very small number of people. And I think Kevin Rudd thinks he's one of those people, and maybe he is to a degree, but I think I'm worried about the centralization of this decision making, and I really want to see more involvement from a lot of people across the United States in discussing our China policy. One initiative that I would like to talk about that I am involved with is something called the Blac China Caucus. In a lot of areas of US society, Black people are drastically underrepresented, and it's very true in the China field as well. And what we're trying to do is to remedy that and to provide more opportunities for people on all levels, from high school and college to mid to senior career professionals, to get them both more involved in the China space and also amplify their voices and their opportunities in the China space. Because really, what the US can and should do with China needs to be a national debate, and we need voices from all across the United States weighing in and saying, this is what we want, this is what we need. You know, it's like, it's not up to me, it shouldn't be up to the administration, it's got to be a raucous national debate. So the more voices and the more informed people we have taking part of that debate, the better I think it will be.
Isaac, thank you for you. We've got you longer than we promised, and we're very pleased to have been able to do so, because you are a delight as a person. And secondly, you're so damn knowledgeable, it puts us to shame in this foreign policy part of the world. And thank you. I'm going to turn us over to Mal, who's going to do whatever he does. Thank you, Isaac.
Thank you, Donald. And thanks to our guest, Isaac Stone-Fish, Don, our facilitator, Joan Kuhn from the library, Carrie Krems from the Media Center, and all of you who chose to participate throughout this fall series and through today's session. In 2 weeks, November the 30th, we will host Professor Emeritus Abe Lowenthal from the University of Southern California, who will address the topic, U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. Professor Lowenthal's session will also be a formal tribute to Dick Dye of the foreign policy at Chappaqua, who passed away a year ago in November. Until we meet again on November the 30th, please have a safe, enjoyable Thanksgiving. We look forward to seeing you all again at the end of this month. Thanks again.